Hi there, I'm Rozzy D along with Michael Forsyth, and you're listening to WQAT-LP FM 99.5. We are the radio station of Allen Temple A.M.E. Church, the downtown church here in Greenville, South Carolina. It is Sunday, October 31st, 2021, and you know what that day is. It's Halloween, but we are in the pre-show time from 1:30 p.m. to 2 p.m., where we talk about today's upcoming show, play a little music, and mention other tidbits that's happening in the community or around the world. Today's segment, we will feature the writer Dacre Stoker. Dacre Stoker happens to be the great-grandson of Bram Stoker. Is that Bram or Bram? Bram Stoker. Sorry about that, Dacre.
He's a great-grandnephew.
He's a great-grandnephew of Bram Stoker, and if you're not familiar who Bram Stoker is, he is the author of the book known as Dracula. You know, the one that says, "I'm come to bite your neck." And also with us today is Chris McAuley, Ph.D., who is a writer, theologian, an expert in Celtic folklore, and Dr. McAuley will discuss the pagan roots of Halloween. So we look forward to having both of our guests on the show today. And since it is October 31st, and this is our final Sunday of focusing on words that pertain to the harvest season, let's mention the word of the day, which is necrophobia. Necrophobia is the irrational fear of dead bodies as well as things associated with death, such as coffins, tombstones, and cemeteries, and all those kinds of things. And of course, we will talk about this word a little later in the segment. So now you have a little bit about the show for today. So hang in there with us because we truly appreciate your support by tuning in. And if you tune in and you want to send some comments to us, you can send those comments to the Allen Temple Radio Facebook group. Again, I'm Rozzy D along with Michael Forsyth. Please stay tuned for more music, commentary, and information here on WQAT.
at hand. Creatures crawl in search of blood to terrorize your neighborhood. And whosoever shall be found without the soul for getting down must stand and face the hounds of hell and rot inside a corpse's shell.
I'm gonna do it tonight.
Stench is in the air, the funk of 40,000 years, and grisly ghouls from every tomb are closing in to seal your doom. And though you fight to stay alive, your body starts to shiver, for no mortal can resist the evil of the thriller.
You just want some more, I think you better call
Ghostbusters!
Ow! Who you gonna call?
Ghostbusters!
Who you gonna call?
Ghostbusters!
think you better call
Ghostbusters!
who you gonna call?
Ghostbusters!
I can't hear you. Who you gonna call?
Ghostbusters!
Louder.
Ghostbusters!
Who you gonna call?
Ghostbusters!
Who can you call?
Ghostbusters!
Who you gonna call?
Ghostbusters!
I was working in the lab late one night when my eyes beheld an eerie sight. For my monster from his slab began to rise, and suddenly, to my surprise,
He did the mash,
he did the monster
the
mash.
monster mash.
It was a graveyard
He
smash.
did the mash,
It caught on in a
he
flash.
did the mash.
He did the monster mash. From my laboratory in the castle east to the master bedroom where the vampires feast, the ghouls all came from their humble abodes to get a jolt from my electrode.
They did the mash,
They did the monster
the
mash.
monster mash.
It was a graveyard
They
smash.
did the mash,
It caught on in a flash.
they did the mash.
They did the monster mash. The zombies were having fun. The party had just begun. The guests included Wolfman, Dracula, and his son. The scene was rocking, all were digging the sounds. Igor on chains, backed by his baying hounds. The coffin bangers were about to arrive with their vocal group, the Crypt Kicker Five.
Played the mash,
They played the monster
the
mash.
monster mash.
It was a graveyard
They
smash.
played the mash,
It caught on in a flash.
they played the mash.
They played the monster mash. Out from his coffin, Drac's voice did ring. Seemed he was troubled by just one thing. Opened the lid and shook his fist and said, "Whatever happened to my Transylvania twist?"
It's now the mash,
It's now the monster
the
mash.
monster mash.
And it's a graveyard
Now
smash.
the mash,
It's caught on in a flash.
it's now the mash.
It's now the monster mash. Now everything's cool. Drac's a part of the band, and my monster mash is the hit of the land. For you, the living, this mash was meant to. When you get to my door, tell them Boris sent you.
Then you can mash,
Then you can monster
the
mash
monster mash.
and do my graveyard
Then you can
smash.
mash,
You'll catch on in a flash.
then you can mash.
Then you can monster mash. Mash. Easy, Igor, you impetuous young boy. Mash good.
Monster mash, monster mash.
Hi again, it's Rosie D along with Michael Forsyth, and you're listening to WQAT-LP FM 99.5. We are the radio station of Allen Temple A.M.E. Church, the downtown church here in Greenville, South Carolina. I want to mention to you today something that I failed to mention a little earlier, that today is the last day of breast cancer awareness, and I just wanted to mention that and pay tribute to those survivors of breast cancer. I also wanted to say that with breast cancer, a lot of people are dealing with that. As a matter of fact, I was on my social media page the other day, and one of my friends had breast cancer that I wasn't even aware that she had it. So, and that made me think. I'm like, it is Breast Cancer Awareness Month. So here is a little something that I would like to mention to all who have had breast cancer or those who may be battling with breast cancer. And this is a tribute from me and a quote from Kay Yow. That's Kayyow. That goes like this: "When life kicks you, let it kick you forward." So to all my breast cancer survivors, past and present, keep on fighting. All right, coming up in the 2 o'clock hour, you will hear from our first guest, horror writer Dacre Stoker. Again, I'm Rozzy D, along with Michael Forsyth. Please stay tuned for more music, commentary, and information here on WQAT.
So I've got my essay written, and I've been working on it for...
Welcome to my home. Enter freely of your own will and leave some of the happiness you bring.
Count Dracula.
I am Dracula. And I bid you welcome, Mr. Harker, to my house. Come in. You will, I trust, excuse me that I do not join you. But I have already dined, and I never drink wine.
Hi there, I'm Rozzy D, and you're listening to WQAT-LP FM 99.5. We are the radio station of Allen Temple A.M.E. Church, the downtown church here in Greenville, South Carolina. Today, our first guest is internationally renowned writer Dacre Stoker. Dacre Stoker is a great-grandnephew of Bram Stoker, and if you didn't know, Bram Stoker is the author of Dracula. However, our guest, Dacre Stoker, is the co-author of the best-selling novel Dracula. Dacre Stoker will speak about several things pertaining to his famous great uncle and the mythical Dracula. So stay tuned for segment 1 of our interview with Dacre Stoker.
This is Michael Forsythe, and you're listening to WQAT, the radio station of Allen Temple A.M.E., the downtown church in Greenville, South Carolina. It's Halloween season, and we're fortunate to have with us an author who has horror in his blood. Dacre Stoker is great-grandnephew of Bram Stoker, the author of Dracula. Dacre is a terrific writer himself, the co-author of 2 internationally best-selling vampire novels, Dracula the Undead and Dracula. Dacre has appeared in multiple documentaries about vampires in literature and popular culture. He also leads tours to locations in the British Isles where Stoker lived, worked, and set his classic novel, as well as to Transylvania to explore the life of the historic Dracula, Vlad the Impaler. Dacre is going to tell us what his research has revealed about his famous forebear, about his own writing, and also a thing or two about vampires. Thank you for joining us, Dacre.
It's great to chat with somebody in my own state, especially around Halloween, which, as we joke in the Stoker family, it's our Super Bowl month. You know, everything comes together for Stokers when it comes to the Halloween season.
Yes. Well, next year will be the 125th anniversary of the publication of Dracula. Bram Stoker did not create vampires, but he defined so much of the lore. Can you tell us what he did in changing how we see vampires?
Absolutely. And you're absolutely right to say he didn't create it. You know, there's two levels that were there before he came on the scene, and one is in English literature. There was actually 3 books out that we know of. John Polidori, who was the first one to create a vampire in English literature, and that was Lord Byron's Doctor, actually. And Varney the Vampire was written by J. Malcolm Rymer, and then Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu's Carmilla, a fellow Irishman to Bram, wrote his story, as I said, Carmilla. So those are 3 books that came on a literature scene before Bram, but all of those authors, as well as Bram Stoker, touched on existing folklore mythology that sort of came out of the Middle Ages in many countries around the world. Bram's research, he actually gave one interview, or only one person asked him for an interview, and in that interview, Jane Stoddard, the British Weekly, that came out just a few months after Bram's Dracula was published in May of 1897. She said, "Where did you get all this information?" And he said, "Well, I've gathered it from numerous sources. And where was it prevalent?" And he mentioned 13 different countries, Michael, where the vampire lore was prevalent, and I found some treaties to back all that up. And it's quite obvious that the majority was a result of communicable diseases that swept through parts of Europe during the Middle Ages. And Bram read, some of these treaties that actually were pointing out that people were exhuming bodies from the graves. And they were doing so because they couldn't understand why so many people were dying so quickly and without obvious reason. And of course, if you just point your finger at one of them, like the plague, here's one example of one of these that is really a good example. There was a plague went through Venice, Italy. 400 people were found in a shallow grave. And of those 400 people in this grave that were found, this fellow Philip Rohr wrote about this. And then years later, he discovered that some of these bodies had bricks in their mouth. And these skeletons, when they were exhumed with these bricks, it was like, well, we've got to find an answer for that. And they found Philip Rohr's writing. And the writing was very typical of many of these treaties. People misinterpreted the contagious nature. They didn't understand germ theory. So one member of the family dies. They put him in the mass grave. And then sure enough, a couple of days later, somebody else in the family dies. And somebody else next door dies. And down the street dies. And there's nobody running around killing people. They don't get it. They think that the spirits of the dead are coming out and taking life from the living. So when they go to exhume the grave, they realize that the bodies are bloated, that the shroud has some sort of red juices around the mouth, which is obviously biological decomposition at work, but it looks to them like this creature, this dead body, has come out of the grave and drank the blood from the living, thus why the other people die and why this one looks like he's full and fat of blood. So the logical thing for them to do is stop this chewing out of the shroud. They're clawing out of the grave, and they stick a brick in the mouth, and quite often they might break the legs, break the arms, turn the arms around so this skeleton, this body can't reanimate. So that's what Bram touched on, and these two ideas that were real in people's minds, that these bodies really were coming out of the grave over about a 200-year period, and learned men from the church, from military doctors, were being sent out to find out what the heck was going on. So what Bram did was obviously write a fictional story that was touching on what was believed to be true. And that's one reason why his story, sort of really, really resonated in the day, because it wasn't that long ago, the 1700s, when this was going on, and then Bram writing in 1897. So that's a short version, Michael, of why Bram touched such a nerve based on the relevant knowledge that people had at their disposal.
Yes. And though now we are, well, I should say, I was about to say we are far removed from the era of contagious diseases, but obviously our knowledge is better now. We understand them, and yet the vampire fascination among people has only increased since then. I mean, there are God knows how many different versions of Dracula and different vampire things on television right now. Why do you think that the fascination with the vampire endures and so strongly today?
Well, it's not an easy question to answer because there's so many different elements of the vampire that it is moved into literature, popular culture, and as you just mentioned, on film and games and streaming, all kinds of different levels of stories, from paranormal romance to sheer horror, everything in between. But here's my theory, Michael, and that is that the essence of the vampire really relies upon something that probably everybody on this planet think of at one time or another. And that is what really happens to my body, my soul, when my life runs out and I die. And obviously we have religion and so many different religions around the world that provide different answers, but in generally a comforting scenario for you live a good life, you're going to have a good afterlife. However, that doesn't answer all the questions for everybody, especially when there were things like unexplained deaths and superstition might take over. And in that case, the concept of immortality, even though it is somewhat horrifying to think of a body coming out of the grave, taking life from others, and therefore needing to continue to survive as an undead creature, taking life from more living creatures. But still, it's a fascinating theme, and it's something, as I mentioned, that people might think about. What is this an option? Now, obviously, Bram Stoker's option back in 1897, was pretty horrifying. But Michael, what you and we've discussed a lot when you and I are at conventions together, the more modern, sexy vampire, they provide some pretty cool options. People, some of these vampires look like they transform into runway models, both male and female, and have a lot of fun and party up a lot. So it's interesting to look at where this has gone, because it's gone in tremendous length since Bram created that more sort of gnarly revenant from the grave type vampire. Nowadays, the vampire is a lot more sexy and alluring.
Yes. Well, a lot of people are related to famous figures in one way or another. Someone who might be find out that the grandson of Grover Cleveland or Rutherford B. Hayes, and it's something they might casually mention at a dinner party or forget about. What led you to become fascinated with Bram Stoker and to end up devoting years into researching his life and work?
Well, first of all, let me sort of paint the picture for the listeners. Bram Stoker is one of 7 children, born and raised in Dublin, Ireland. His youngest brother, who was my great-grandfather, had 2 children. He was actually one of 3 doctors in the family, George Stoker. He moved to London, actually lived with Bram when Bram moved to London to manage the Lyceum Theatre. But I was initially interested in finding out who George Stoker was and what did he do, and what is my, I'm a direct descendant from him. Well, this guy is quite interesting. He is an Irish medical doctor serving in different military campaigns in the forerunner of the Red Cross, which was called the Stratford Ambulance. He was on the side of the Turks, if you can believe it.
Wow.
In the war of, I think it was 1877, against the Russians. He served with the Zulus in the Zulu Wars in South Africa. So he had a lot of street training, let's just say, in military medical situations. He came back to London and invented ozone therapy, if you could believe it. But to get to your point, I was trying to figure out who he was, and he had two children. One of them, the son, moved to Canada, Montreal, after World War I, Thomas Thornley Stoker, and that's how my branch of the family started. George's daughter never married, never had children. So it was my quest to find out about that information, that side of family. When I found out that George lived with Bram, was very close to Bram, he actually did the doctoring for the people at the Lyceum Theatre while Bram managed it. I found letters back and forth, and then it was just sort of a natural occurrence to go, okay, well, obviously in medical circles, some of the Stoker brothers are very famous, and two others were as well. But when it comes to literary circles, I got to look into Bram Stoker because, it's funny, more people are interested in guys writing Gothic horror stories than inventing medical procedures and so on. And then it was, oh my God, there was just so much about Bram Stoker that other people had written about. There's now 5 biographies, some biopics, which are interested, and then just there's a general fascination with the subject Dracula and the ongoing mystery, Michael, that I know you and I, again, we chat about at conventions, because nobody really knows exactly, definitively, what were the main inspirations for Bram Stoker writing Dracula, and how is it related to his life? Did he have certain problems? Was he mentally unstable? Was he a drug addict? Like some of the horror writers that you and I know of are. But it turns out that I needed to look into his whole life and what other people say about him. And that sort of brought me to the doorstep of some pretty interesting discoveries that, one I made myself, and others people consult with me. And I'm the guy that tends to be the one that puts these sort of collective pieces of the puzzle together to then help answer some of these questions about what were some of Bram's inspirations and motivations for writing Dracula. And then I use that stuff in the novels that you mentioned earlier in the show, because what purpose can this stuff serve if I just keep it to myself? Some of it I published and put it on websites, but to me the most fun is using that information in fictional novels where people have a hard time deciphering the difference between what is real and what is not real.
Yes. Well, perhaps you could tell us what were some of the more interesting and surprising things that you found about Bram Stoker's life as you researched, found things in libraries and private collections. What were some of the things you found out that surprised you?
Well, I guess probably the first one is that the guy almost didn't live for the first 7 years of his. Won trophies for long-distance race walking, participated in rowing, all-round athletics champion at Trinity College in track and field. So whatever it was that made him sick, he recovered from it and then some. So that was probably, the first most important thing about his life that I then used later on, and we'll get into the writing of Dracula later. The other thing, that I want to mention pertaining to this question is just recently, and this is incredible, Michael, because you mentioned the 125th anniversary, and there's still interest to find out things, even at the institutional level. The London Library in London, England, the head of fundraising was a Dracula fan, and he had picked up a copy of published Dracula notes that Elizabeth Miller and Robert Bassang had published, and in the back of the notes was the listing of 26 books that Bram had used for his research. And this fellow, Philip Spedding at the London Library, thought, I know Bram was a member here. I wonder if any of these books are still here in our library. So the records, unfortunately, were not great because the place had been bombed during World War II and they'd changed locations. So they didn't have the booklet that says, on a certain date, Bram Stoker signed out these books. But they had, and he found, much to his astonishment, of the 28 books Bram listed, 26 of them were still in general circulation in the library. And furthermore, they had mysterious notes in the margins. They have check marks, underlining, NB for nota bene, mem, just like Bram Stoker writes in Dracula from Jonathan Harker. So he contacted me, Philip did, and another fellow, Robert Bassang, because he knew we were working on Bram Stoker annotated Dracula, and we were experts on it. But he didn't know that I had in my possession, I borrowed from my cousins, Bram's great-grandsons, a edition of Dracula that Bram had actually marked up himself at the request of his publisher to reduce the word count from Dracula, published in 1897, by 30,000 words to create the first short version, abridged version of Dracula to come out in paperback in 1901. So this book was full of these little notes and markings. And it turned out, Michael, they were very, very similar to the notes and markings in the London Library books. And furthermore, Philip was able to identify 2 books that Bram Stoker's son, Noel, donated to the London Library after Bram had died. So they came right from Bram's library, and they also had similar markings in them. So with these 2 sources, we were able to really definitively say Bram Stoker was a little bit naughty. He defaced the library books with a pencil, albeit, but it shows the things that Bram was looking for and it what caught his eye. And it was most surprising to me that there was a general fascination, and it showed up in these books by respected authors, one man of the church, other explorers, one man who was a great thinker of his time, that there was great interest in the paranormal, in the occult, in the supernatural, in vampirism. And as I looked through these things that Bram had checked off, and I quickly was able to snap pictures of all these things with my iPhone, so I used them in my research. And then I went and bought copies of the same books off of a book so I could read the entire book. And I got this great revelation that Bram Stoker didn't invent all this, he just perfected it. But he took existing thoughts that were fringe, let's just say, Michael, fringe thoughts about these emerging sciences and also beliefs that even in the late 1800s, when religion was at its strongest, but it was beginning to wane a little bit in certain areas, and superstition was making comeback. The Order of the Golden Dawn, the Hellfire Club, these kind of these clubs, let's say, that were offshoots of Freemasonry, were beginning to get momentum because people wanted to know, and they were not able to discuss this stuff in open in public, but they could write it in books. They could discuss it in these behind the curtain type rooms. And what Bram did was he researched these and he utilized these thoughts and ideas in his novel Dracula. So those 2 things really jumped out at me, Michael, as aha moments about Bram himself, and that it wasn't just great imagination. It was existing thoughts that were edgy things, and I'm sure Bram knew if he could turn this into a good novel that people would want to read it, and he kept them on their, they kept them on edge. That willful suspension of disbelief that you and I chat about as authors, that's what he implemented into his story. Make the people think, or at least pause, that this stuff is real, and then you've really got your readers.
Because it seems like he was trying to get on the cutting edge of both existing technology and existing, say, beliefs in the occult.
Absolutely. That's what a good writer or a good theater manager, as Bram was, they've got to be edgy and get people thinking and get them to fit into their theater or to buy the books. He himself was interested in technology. They helped integrate into the Lyceum Theater electric lighting and to move away from gaslighting, which was very somewhat dangerous at the time. But this was also timed in England, the center of the universe at the time, when gaslighting was coming in and the telegram was coming in. The telegraph, there was the recording phonograph that Bram utilized in Dracula. All these methods of communication were new, and the Kodak camera was new, used in Dracula. The searchlight in Whitby was brand new, used in Dracula. So I think what Bram was getting at, in a certain extent, Michael, was we recognize the power of the supernatural, but let's also embrace the power of technology, and let's not overdo it, but we've got to fight fire with fire. There's a lot of power in the supernatural, the unknown, the dark, and there's a lot of power, and it scared the heck out of people with this new technology, but if used properly by good thinking men, and as we know, in Dracula, women. Bram was ahead of his time in his respect for and his feminist views, and I'm sure he got this from his mother and his two sisters, and that's how he created Mina Harker the way she was known as the New Woman. Heck, most women in those days were not allowed to even use a typewriter, and yet that's one of the salvations that Mina was able to provide to Van Helsing to type up all the notes that came off the recording phonograph of Seward, and Van Helsing had all this paper and his information, but he couldn't get it together, and Mina volunteered to type them all up so that they could hand out all the notes, the diaries, the journals, to the different band of heroes to figure out what the heck was going on. So he was ahead of his time, and he used it in a really interesting way.
Hi there, this is Rozzy D, and you're listening to WQAT-LP FM 99.5. We are the radio station of Allen Temple A.M.E. Church, the downtown church here in Greenville. You have just listened to the first part of our interview with Dacre Stoker. We are going to take a musical break and continue with part 2 of our interview with Dacre Stoker. So stay with us because there is more on the way here on WQAT.
Van Helsing. Van
Hey again, it's Rosie D along with Mike Forsyth, and again, this is WQAT-LP FM 99.5, the radio station of Allen Temple A.M.E. Church, the downtown church here in Greenville, South Carolina. Well, you have just listened to that first part of the interview with Dacre Stoker, and the rest of that is coming up after I get through gabbing a little bit here with Michael. But since it is Halloween, let's talk a little bit about this day. You know, Halloween has many names, if you don't know that. All Saints Day is one day name, All Hallows Day, or the Eve of the Saints. And in other countries, it is also celebrated on different days. Like November 1st is a day, I don't remember which country it is, but November 1st, February 21st, and May 13th. So, Michael, I just want to have a little brief discussion with you about Halloween, and what are some of your thoughts on Halloween? How do you feel about celebrating it? Do you celebrate it? What do you have to say about that?
Well, for me, Halloween is one of those holidays that for me has just kind of gotten better and better over the years. You know, when I was a kid, we would go trick-or-treating, but number one, I had glasses. Mm-hmm. You know, you have a mask, you can't breathe, you can't see. Mm-hmm. And for some reason, we belong to the Ethical Culture Society, so instead of trick-or-treating for candy,
right, we
would trick-or-treat for one-dime donations to UNICEF, which is, you know, it's helping the poor, but, you know.
Absolutely.
And so it got didn't really get fun until... like I was in, you know, a young adult, and you start to go like to college parties and stuff. It got a little bit more fun. Mm-hmm. And then once I had kids, I found it more fun, you know, taking the kids around and having them have fun.
Right.
And now the thing for holidays for Halloween is we just will watch a fun, scary movie as kids, as a family. And my daughter Alexia does not really like really scary movies, so it'll be something fun like Ghostbusters. And in fact, this evening, my nephew and I, Dylan, because my kids are away at college, but my nephew who's 8, we're going to see one of my all-time favorite horror comedies. We're going to see Abbott and Costello meets Frankenstein.
Ooh. Well, let me tell you my little thing about Halloween and my views on it. When I was a kid, I used to celebrate Halloween and get all excited. Ooh, Halloween, we're going to go trick-or-treating and dress up with your costumes on, and you go out and you scare people and you get scared. And I'm like, wow, that was just great as a kid. But then, you know, I got older and, you know, kind of on my spiritual journey, I kind of learned some things about Halloween. And I said, ooh, you know, I really shouldn't be celebrating this. So, and as an adult, I didn't really celebrate it. You know, Ashley kind of missed out a little bit when she was a kid. I didn't let her celebrate. I'm like, no, we're not going to celebrate that because of the meaning behind it. It's a pagan holiday. And, you know me and my holy roly thing sometimes. I'm like, I just didn't let her do that. So, but I do remember when I lived in Germany, on Halloween, we would just do really crazy things. I remember one really fun thing we did. We went to a movie theater and watched Rocky Horror Picture Show. So we got to throw our bread and make it rain and put our umbrellas up and all of that. So that was kind of exciting for me when, you know, I would celebrate Halloween. But now I really don't celebrate it because, you know, of the history of it. I really don't celebrate it. But, you know, if that's your thing to do, then, you know, I'm not knocking you. If you like to celebrate Halloween, then go ahead, have fun, you know, just be careful. So those are my thoughts on Halloween. But now let's circle back to our word of the day, which is necrophobia. The word necrophobia is spelled Necrophobia, which is another one of our phobias that we kind of talked about earlier in the month. And necrophobia, it's derived from the Greek word necros for corpse, necrophobia or necrophilia is the irrational fear of dead bodies as well as things associated with death such as coffins, tombstones, and cemeteries. Necrophobia may also be used to mean a fear of the dead, a belief that spirits of the dead will return and haunt you and the living. So, when we were young and your parents would like say, so you better be good, or something's going to come out and get you, one of those ain't's going to get you. You know how they would do us, to make us act right. But often something triggers the fear, such as a close encounter with a dead animal or the funeral of a loved one. Now, I'm not really keen on dead animals, especially when I see them on this side of the road. I'm like, ooh, I don't like that. But that's where the word necrophobia derives from. It is a Greek word and it comes from necros. So you got anything else to say about Halloween, Michael?
Well, I would just say that that fear of the dead body, the fear of funerals. Funerals really used to terrify me.
They used to do me the same way. I was so afraid. I'm like, oh, this people gonna rise, because you watch those horror movies.
Yeah.
And your mind starts thinking, oh, this person's gonna rise up and get me and bite me on the neck and all that foolishness. But
I think it's really when it came to dead loved ones that I really started to wrap my mind around the concept that, well, this is a dead body,
right,
and the person is gone. And my father, when he passed away, he was 85, right. And I remember his body you could just see it looked like a husk. Whatever was there, right. You just sensed it was gone.
It was just a shell, and that's the thing. When people die, a lot of people are afraid of dead people or dead bodies, when really you shouldn't be afraid of dead people. My mother used to tell me, you should worry about the living as opposed to the dead, because the dead, they've gone on and they can't bother you. That's just a shell where your soul resided at one point and the soul left. So why are you afraid of it, So I'm not afraid of dead bodies anymore, because I'm just not. I've had too many, loved ones pass away too, just to not be afraid. And you're like, hey, that's my loved one. I wasn't afraid of them. Why should I be afraid of them, in a different state there? So, yeah, people are really weird about dead bodies, Oh, I'm not going to go on their funeral home by myself. And I'm like, what is it? Do you think they're just going to rise up and get you? They're not going to. They can't harm you. So, I don't know. It's just something crazy. The Bible says that, you shouldn't be too concerned about what happens to a person's physical body when they die. It's that person's soul has either gone to heaven or hell. So they can't harm you. How do you feel about cemeteries?
Yeah, I really haven't had that particular fear so much of cemeteries. I guess they're kind of tranquil to me. So I don't think I've had that really association of fear with them. I mean, I wouldn't. I don't think I'd go to one at night.
What?
And I don't know. There was a movie. And these people were just asking for trouble. A horror movie. The people danced. They danced on people's graves.
Oh.
The name of the movie was Cemetery Dancers, and quite naturally they end up getting haunted. But
Right.
I wouldn't ask for trouble.
Exactly, and I wouldn't do that. I think that's kind of disrespectful. You're dancing on somebody's grave. But cemeteries, they don't creep me out. Again, when I lived over in Europe, and the people it was said, I don't know this for sure, but they say that in Germany they don't bury people laying flat. They bury them, vertically to save the space. And those cemeteries would just be so beautiful that I would just go walking just to look. It was just a really beautiful, peaceful place. It was so quiet in there, and I'm not afraid of that kind of stuff, or dead people, or cemeteries, or things like that. Now, I probably wouldn't want to see someone before they're, if they've recently passed away and they've crashed and got hurt or burnt or something like that. I wouldn't want to see that part of it, but I'm not really afraid of cemeteries and the dead. So that's just something, about me. I guess I'm weird, but anyway. So does anything in particular creep you out, Michael? Do you have anything that spooks you, or, what about that?
Well, I can't really think of anything other than my own mind at night. I'm been a person who's been tended to have some pretty intense nightmares, and Hold on a second. I'm just let my nephew Dylan speak for a minute. My nephew Dylan, who's 8 years old, is right here with me. Dylan, you sometimes have nightmares?
Yep, I do have nightmares. It's terrible. It's sometimes I can't even sleep for 2 hours.
Yeah, so, I just, you just have to remind yourself, okay, this was not real, and maybe your mind was trying to tell you something.
Mm-hmm, right. Like they say, when sometimes if the witch is riding your back when you sleep the wrong way and you get numb and, oh, God, the witch is riding my back. People say stuff like that, but really it's not the witch riding your back. It's probably, what do you call that when you sleep the wrong way and you aggravate that nerve? That's what that is. But
that's called getting old.
Yeah, exactly, right. But anyway, so if you have those fears out there, don't fear the dead, don't fear cemeteries, don't fear scary movies. But if they bother you, don't watch them either. So, I'm just saying all that stuff that we were taught when we were kids, that's all not real. And usually, if somebody's died, they've gone to heaven or hell. That's just my belief, and I'm sticking with that. All right. So coming up is the second part of Dacre Stoker's interview. So, you guys keep listening in because he's going to finish up. And then after that, in the 3 o'clock hour, we will have our writer, Chris McAuley, on, who will talk about the pagan origins of Halloween. And again, this is Rozzy D along with Michael Forsyth and Dylan. So please stay tuned with us here on WQAT-LP FM 99.5.
And Roz, you're going to enjoy this. You're a Rocky Horror Picture Show fan, so the next number will be coming up from that.
It's astounding. Time is fleeting. Madness takes its toll. But listen closely, not for very much longer. I've got to keep control. I remember doing the time warp, drinking those moments when the blackness would hit me, the void would be calling. Let's do the time warp again. Let's do the time warp again. It's just a jump to the left, and then a step to the right. With your hands on your hips, you bring your knees in tight. But it's a pelvic floor that really drives you insane. Let's do the time warp again. Let's do the time warp again. So dreamy, oh fantasy freely, so you can't see me, no, not at all. In another dimension, with voyeuristic intention, well secluded, I see all. With a bit of a mind flip, you're into the time slip, and nothing can ever be the same. Your space station, like you're under sedition. Let's do the time warp again. Let's do the time warp again. But now he's walking down the street, just having a think, when the snake of a guy gave an evil wink. He shook me up, took me by surprise. Had a pickup truck and the devil's eyes stared at me, and I felt a change. Time meant nothing, never would again. Let's do the time warp again. Let's do the time warp again. It's just a jump to the left, and then a step to the right. With your hands on your hips, you're bringing knees in tight. But
helping. Now that you have learned what you have learned, it would be well for you to return to your own country. I prefer to remain and protect those whom you would destroy. You are too late. My blood now flows through her veins. She will live through the centuries to come, as I have lived. Should you escape us, Dracula, we know how to save Miss Mina's soul, if not her life. If she dies by day, but I shall see that she dies by night, and I will have Carfax Abbey torn down stone by stone, excavated a mile around. I will find your earth box and drive that stake through your heart.
You know, some of the things you uncovered were, A, different drafts of Dracula, different versions altogether, an Icelandic, a Swedish version, as well as a version that had an alternate ending altogether. Could you tell listeners a little bit about those?
Oh, geez, we could go on for hours. I'll try to keep this one short. One of the coolest things J.D. Barker and I did in our research for Dracul, we knew, we had a pretty good idea what existed in the Dracula typescript that Bram had actually given Walt Whitman's friend and lawyer, Thomas Donaldson, sometime obviously after 1897. That typescript ended up in a barn in Pennsylvania and discovered 50 years later and sold at auction. And Paul Allen, the co-founder of Microsoft's estate, purchased it. Paul Allen, who's no longer living, I did meet him when we went out there, but he loved to collect all kinds of weird and interesting things from guitars to Star Trek sets to the Dracula typescript, and we were allowed to study it. And what we were looking for were clues about things that were taken out. And we found two major things, Michael, and one of them was that the typescript as we know it, and Dracula as we know it, starts at page 102. So 101 pages were taken out. And I was able to see, and I had a pretty good idea what it was, because Bram's widow published a short story called Dracula's Guest 2 years after Bram died. 1914 it came out. And the preface to that, she said, this was excised from my husband's most famous book for length. So 17-page story out of 101 pages taken out. It leaves a bunch of others unaccounted for. But I was able to confirm that Dracula's Guest was once part of that, because in the typescript, there was 3 passages that were things that happened in Dracula's Guest crossed out in the existing manuscript. So it would be like things that the character Harker thought back of. He says, "Oh, my throat was sore, like the scratching of what the wolf did to my throat back in Munich." So Dracula's Guest happened in Munich, but Dracula, as we know it, does not start until Harker's on the train getting into Romania. So it was looking back, and he had to take those things out. The other thing that was really interesting was that the ending of Dracula as we know it, where Quincy Morris and Jonathan Harker are able to, with the help of the other band of heroes, fight off the gypsies who were guarding Count Dracula, who was in the coffin, or the crate, as it was getting drawn by horses, getting close to the castle in northern Transylvania, just as the sun was going to go down and the Count would get all his powers back. This great, unbelievable ending. Quincy Morris thrusts his Bowie knife into the chest of Dracula. Harker slits his throat with a kukri blade, and Dracula crumbles into dust. And then, unbeknownst to most people, because it was edited out, a massive volcano erupted. And that was taken out. Now, a couple of points on that. Number one, we have since figured out, Hans de Roos, a Dutch-German researcher, realized that the notes for Dracula actually contain two sets of coordinates, longitude and latitude, pointing to an extinct volcano in northern Transylvania. I've actually been there to verify all this, and had one heck of a day or two. But what it shows was Bram Stoker was planning to have a very definitive ending to his story, and obviously do away with his count and anyone else who got in the way of a volcanic eruption. But he didn't. Either he or his editor took it out. So it begs the question, with that less than definitive ending, did Bram really want Dracula to end, or was his crumbling into dust just his way to shapeshift to get the heck out of there and to come back, regenerate, and come back another day?
Well, I always thought
those are two cool things.
Yeah,
found in that typescript.
Yeah, the Bowie use of a Bowie knife, at least by our standards, is a little iffy when you're trying to get rid of a vampire.
You know that. I mean, Michael, what is the right way to get it? Bram even says it in the novel. What's the right way to get rid of a vampire? What do you use?
Yes, a wooden stake. You're right.
Yeah. No, I mean, who knows? Maybe the wooden stakes got dropped in the battle, the heat of the moment. I don't think Bram would have forgotten.
Yeah.
He's a sharp guy.
Yeah.
There was a good reason, and I think that's what we're figuring out now, is maybe he was planning a sequel, or maybe he wanted his great-grandnephew 100 years later to write the sequel.
Right. Well, you wrote a sequel, but you also wrote what I found even more interesting was the prequel that you co-authored with J.D. Barker. And it's just a wonderful book. I really recommend it to people because it really is so steeped in history that gives it a real believability. And then it's a very original story and just genuinely scary. And basically you interweave some of these biographical details that you learned about Bram with the vampire legend. Can you give the listeners a brief explanation of the brief intro of the story, what it's about?
Yeah, and I do agree with you. The sequel was a good start for me. I've honed my skills since then, putting out Dracula Dead with Ian Holt, and this story, Dracul, with J.D. Barker. J.D. is a very polished writer. He's since now written 2 bestsellers with James Patterson. So I got to him when he was, accessible anyway. But the whole concept of the prequel to Dracula was we go through Bram Stoker's life and that of his family and show very believable, and you're right, some of them are absolutely true, situations and things in his life, like his strange recovery from his mysterious illness, like the nanny that the Stokers really had, and sort of look at possibilities of how he could have made this miraculous recovery. Could there have been some supernatural intervention? And then, if that's the case, what would that have meant? We introduce an interesting fellow, Arminius Vambury, who really was part of Dracula. There's no question. And he was really a part of Bram Stoker's life. He met him, and I think he was a lot of source of this Eastern European history. So we bring these real people in and begin sort of a way to explain some horrific things that happened both in real life and then fictional. Things like grave robbing that really did happen in Ireland. Bram's eldest brother, who really helped him do the medical aspects of the novel, Thornley Stoker, he's a character. His wife really does go insane, Emily, in real life, and we had her get affected, let's say, without doing spoilers here, by vampires, and this sort of chase throughout Europe and to places where Bram really went, Whitby. And we also integrate Irish folklore mythology, stories that we have a pretty darn good idea that Bram was told, we integrate those into the story so people would sort of sit back and go, or, you know, like, oh, I wonder if, geez, I've heard that story. I wonder if that's really where it came from. How could that really be? So there's this sort of great feeling that JD and I get when we get emails from people and reviewers go, my God, this book was so readable, and it reads just like it was, you know, it's supposed to be connected to Dracula, but we can't tell what is fiction and what is not. Please tell me. No, did this really happen? And I say, well, there is an author's note where we do spill the beans a bit, but you know, you're going to have to read that for yourself.
Yeah, I think that's always the ultimate compliment to a writer when people think, well, this must really have happened. Well, you know, you mentioned Ireland, and that was my favorite part of the book, really, was the sort of tale within the tale of the Derg Dhu, who is the Irish vampire. What is the vampiric, the Irish roots of vampire legends?
Oh, there's a lot of them. The Derg Dhu was just one, and that was also an interesting part of my research because, you know, quite frankly, you know, you think of leprechauns and a pot of gold and maybe the caricature who is the logo of the Notre Dame Fighting Irish. You think, oh, they're all just happy little fighting Irish guys, but no, Michael, they've got steep cautionary tales in their folklore mythology, things like changelings and banshees and pukas, and the fairies are not like Tinkerbell and the fairy godmother. These are creatures that, you know, are kind of parallel world, and they'll be mischievous, and some of them, you know, banshees are, you know, they wail off in the distance, and that means death is coming. So they're really, really reach and steeped in this horrific type of tales, and vampires are one of them. And the Derg Dhu of Waterford was one of them that we just absolutely loved. And it's basically, you know, a story of a young girl, beautiful girl, and it's a greedy father that, you know, wants to marry her off to the best deal he can get for a dowry. And, you know, that really goes on in history, but somehow this got turned around, and it's this cautionary tale, you know, to fathers, don't do this. It could come back to backfire. And this Derg Dhu story was one that was perfectly integrated into our real story of the nanny, Ellen Crone, that came to the Stokers as a young lady and offered her services as a housemaid. And she became the housemaid and the nanny for all 7 children and lived with them all her life. They actually buried her when they died, and I actually found in the Trinity College University archives a clump of her hair wrapped up, you know, in an envelope inside another envelope owned by Bram's eldest brother, Thornley.
Well, that's so, just weird.
A deep connect. Yeah, isn't that weird? Not kidding.
Maybe there's something. Oh, man, yeah.
So this story, it was a perfect fit when JD and I said, well, we need some explanation how to make her more mysterious and maybe integrate her into some vampiric folklore. And it was like, well, let's just use the Derg Dhu and have her as that young lady who then travels the world trying to, you know, get redemption and find the man who she loved and get payback on her father as a vampire.
Yes, it's just fantastic. Well, you know, your research and you're just taking you to travel to those locations where Bram Stoker lived and worked, where he set parts of his story, and of course, most glamorous, over to what is now Romania, the site of Vlad the Impaler's castle. But you also were specifically looking for the castle that was the model for Bram Stoker's fictional Castle Dracula. Can you tell us about your adventure?
Boy, yeah, I think I've now been there 12 times, and the first few times was sort of, you know, finding the castle and then finding the location. And it took a lot of background work and the help of this fellow Hans de Roos to realize this, and I'm summarizing all these trips, Michael, but there's a famous tourist attraction nowadays called Bran Castle, and it's near Brasov, Romania, just in Transylvania, and it is a wonderful castle. It's the most popular tourist attraction, and Vlad the Impaler may have spent a few days there. It's not one of his places where he hanged out, because the real Vlad the Impaler was a prince of Wallachia, which is in the southern part of Romania. Transylvania is up on the top, but Bran Castle is on the border. And there's other castles associated with Vlad. Targovishta, there's a Ponari fortress, and there's also a palace right in Bucharest. But what I found out was Bran Castle, which calls itself Dracula's Castle, to capitalize obviously on the novel, the movies, and Vlad the Impaler, was actually used by Bram Stoker as the exterior model for his fictional castle Dracula. In two of his books in the London Library that I mentioned earlier in the show, there were sketches of this castle, and it was the only castle there were sketches of. So Bram Stoker, looking through these books, came upon these sketches and described the exterior almost exactly as they appear in the sketches. But his location for the story, because of the volcanic mountains in the Carpathians up in the northeast quadrant, and the name of the pass nearby, the Borgo Pass, which I just love that name, Michael, and it's not made up. It really is a Borgo Pass in these mountains. And it just happens to be about 20 miles away from the Mount Israel, this volcanic mountain, which coincides with the lines of longitude and latitude that Hans de Roos found in the notes. So we found the location. We know what castle Bram imagined to be up there, and I had to go there. I took my son, and we hired a guide, and a couple of fellows, friends of ours, came with us, and we had a very Jonathan Harker day. It was a nightmare, actually. We only had 2 days of our whole trip to do it, and weather closed in, but we went anyway. It took us about 2.5 hours up some very steep hiking to get to the top. And when we got to the top and raised the Stoker flag we brought with us, the coat of arms, and I left some notes in a canister hidden under rocks. If you find this, email me. You found the location of Bram Stoker's fictional castle. Getting down was a problem because the night was beginning to fall and the storm was rolling in, and going down the very steep way would have been dangerous because what we walked up through was an old logging site which left very sharp stobs in the ground. And so I made the decision on behalf of the team, guys, we can't go down that way. If somebody slips and falls, there is impalement. And just as bad as the type Vlad used to do back in the 15th century. So we took the long way, which is going all the way around the cone of the volcano, and we found a road and a weather station where we ended up getting a ride back. But it was 2.5 hours up and about 6.5 hours down. And it ended up, we made friends with the guy that saved us, and he brought us to the administration of the park, where they loved to hear our Jonathan Harker tale, and they made fun of us for not preparing ourselves well for the trip up and down. But they invited me to come back, and if I came back and brought a plaque, they would honor it and put it up and create a trail on different terrain, which when I did go back 2 years later, Michael, with the plaque, it's quite funny, and I laughed the whole way. Had we known this other way to get in, and we had known the right connections, we could have gone in by a 4x4 vehicle and got within about half a mile of the peak, rather than climbing up like we did and down like we did. But, nothing can be easy, otherwise it's not worth it.
Yeah, but I got to tell you, I'm so glad that you got through safely, because imagine what a great headline it would have been if Bram Stoker's descendant, more or less, had fallen to his death and been impaled while escaping Dracula's castle. That. But You know, I wanted to.
I would have rather been injured rather than dead, because I would have loved to have lived there. You had to live that tale down. It would have been very embarrassing for the rest of my life.
So let me ask you this. You know, Bram Stoker, the only other work of his that I'm familiar with was Lair of the White Worm, another interesting, creepy story. He wrote a bunch of other novels. Are any of the others worth reading to the average person? Are they interesting?
Oh, yeah. Lair of the White Worm is a sad story to it. It is strange and somewhat disconnected. It was turned into a movie that actually had Hugh Grant in it. And it is a bit vampiric, but he had one stroke at the time, and it's the last thing he ever wrote, and he wasn't at his best. But there's two, I found a lot of background for some of his other stories, so I direct listeners to read, number one, Dracula's Guest. It's a really good short story, and it ties in nicely. Actually, J.D. Barker and I made sure that it tied in very nicely to Dracul and Dracula. So if you like any of those stories, read that one. Mystery of the Sea, Michael, is not vampiric, but it was written based on activities that Bram came to learn in Cruden Bay, Scotland, where Bram actually wrote Dracula. People always think, oh, he wrote Dracula in Whitby, England. No, he took copious notes on one 3-week holiday in Whitby, and that's why he chose to have the Count arrive in Whitby and St. Mary's Church and Whitby Abbey, and that's why J.D. Barker and I sent parts of Dracul there. But he actually did the writing on these extended summer holidays when he was in Cruden Bay, Scotland. And as a matter of fact, the interior of his fictional castle Dracula is based on the interior of a Scottish lord's castle in Cruden Bay called Slane's Castle. There is a very obvious and unique octagonal room in the middle of Slane's Castle, and if your listeners Google that today, because the roof is no longer on it and it's a ruin, you can see the octagonal room as described by Bram Stoker in Chapter 2 of Dracula. And so in that town, Bram wrote Dracula. He was inspired for some things in Dracula. The Mystery of the Sea is set there, and it is a very cool story all about smuggling and the Spanish Armada, stuff that really happened there. He wrote another one called The Water's Mouth, about a mysterious death that happened there. He wrote something called The Seer, which is second sight, something that Bram was very interested in. The Jewel of Seven Stars is a Egyptian type of vampire story where a mummy comes alive as a vampire. He was very interested in Egyptology. Again, books in the London Library. In his own library reveal that. And Oscar Wilde's father, Dr. William Wilde, went to Egypt, and Bram was very friendly with the whole Wilde family. And Dr. Wilde wrote a report on bringing back a mummy to England and the curse that may have gone with that. So there's definitely other stories. I'm going to finish this little monologue with one of them in particular, because one of my latest things is turning some of these short stories that Bram Stoker wrote into graphic novels. And the most recent one we've done, which is the first one, we're working on a second one right now, was a story called The Squaw that Bram wrote about a trip to Nuremberg, and we've changed it for politically correct reasons to be named The Virgin's Embrace. And that is now a graphic novel that Chris McAuley and I, an Irishman, have adapted, and a brilliant artist in England, Jessica Martin, has done the artistry, and that's available on Amazon, both in paperback and hardcover. But it's a wonderful way to get to know some of Bram's other stories in an easy way. But it's a horrific story. It's one that Christopher Lee actually, somebody said, "What do you think of Bram Stoker's writings?" He said, "Well, of course I've read Dracula and The Lair of the White Worm, just as you have, Michael. But the Squaw is the most horrifying tale of all." That's Christopher Lee giving it a pretty good blurb.
Yeah, he ought to know, Dracula himself.
Exactly.
So you're working on another graphic novel, and what else do you have coming up that people would want to know about?
Well, the next graphic novel is the true story that Bram's mother told him about herself as a 14-year-old girl surviving the cholera epidemic in Western Ireland and people being misdiagnosed, buried prematurely, horrific stuff that really, really happened, and she narrowly missed getting the deadly disease herself. And this is a story she told young Bram, and at his request, she typed it up and sent it to him years later. He used that for the basis for a story, The Invisible Giant, that he put into his first book of children's short stories. So we're working through some of those stories, turning into graphic novels. Chris McAuley has also gotten a lot of press in the world of gaming, and he's an expert developer, and so we're working on taking some of Dracula lore and turning these into tabletop games, dice games, console games, mobile games, and probably the final thing to say, which is really exciting, especially because the 125th anniversary is next year, we're working on a definitive graphic novel series, which when you put the whole thing together will be Dracula, but things that I mentioned earlier in the show, elements taken out of Dracula because the editor took it out, things that Bram took out, and also things that were in development in his notes that never made it into the original typescript. So this is going to be a Dracula sort of plus, but in the form of a graphic novel.
Oh, I love it.
Video stories that we're working on. So yeah, it's a big year coming up for us, Michael. And thank you for asking.
Yes, and I got to get one of the first signed copies of that. That just sounds awesome. Well, how can listeners find out more about you and your work? Where can they find it?
Well, thank you for asking. Probably the best place is Stoker McAuley on Facebook, my own personal Facebook page, Dacre Stoker. But the best website at the moment is bramstokerestate.com. Has all the books that we sell. And then there's another website, dacrestoker.com, actually has information about the tours and the books as well.
Great. Well, thank you so much for speaking to me like this. I always enjoy our conversations.
Well, Michael, you're most welcome, and I appreciate you sort of bringing Halloween to the South and reminding people, that, the horror is a big part of it. Yes, it's candies and dress up, but it started in Ireland, home of Bram Stoker, and it's a pretty interesting part of the year for me. Everybody wants to know about Dracula and Bram Stoker. So all the best wishes for a safe and happy Halloween to everybody in Greenville.
Thank you. You've been listening to our discussion with author and researcher Dacre Stoker. I'm Michael Forsyth on WQAT, the radio station of Allen Temple A.M.E., the downtown church in Greenville, South Carolina.
People leader to me. It was a one-eyed, one-horned, flying purple people leader. One-eyed, one-horned, flying purple people leader. One-eyed, one-horned, flying purple people leader. Sure looks strange to me. Well, he came down to earth heard him say in a voice so gruff,
I wouldn't need you 'cause you're so tough.
it was a one-eyed, one-horn, flying purple people need a one-eyed, one-horn, flying purple people need a one-eyed, one-horn, flying purple people need a sure looks strange to me. I said, Mr. Purple People Eater, what's your line? He said, it's eating purple people sure is fine. That's not the reason that I came to land. Wanna get a job in a rock and roll band. Bless my soul, rock and roll.
Hi again, it's Rozzy D. I'm going with Michael Forsyth. And again, you're listening to WQAT-LP FM 99.5. We are the radio station of Allen Temple A.M.E. Church, the downtown church here in Greenville, South Carolina. Again, I want to thank internationally renowned writer Dacre Stoker for a wonderful interview about his writing and research in the horror genre and the history of his great-granduncle, Bram Stoker. We truly thank you for being on today's segment. And if anyone out there would like more information about Dacre Stoker, his books and his work, please visit his website at dacrestoker.com or bramstokerestate.com. Let me just tell you my little story about ties to a horror scene, Michael. I don't know if we were talking about it kind of off the air here, but I have some ties to a horror scene here. Again, I'm talking about when I lived in Germany. When I was in the military, I used to just go everywhere. I'm like, oh, this is an opportunity of a lifetime. I may never get this opportunity again. So I kind of just went everywhere. I visited different places. And one of the places that I visited was the medieval castle remains of Frankenstein's castle. And Frankenstein's castle, if you don't know about, Mary Shelley, she wrote the book, Frankenstein. And my ties is when I visited to that medieval castle. The remains there, made famous by Mary Shelley, in this little city called Darmstadt, Germany. Darmstadt, Mühltal, Germany. And it's a little hilltop castle. And the Oldenwald, as they call it, Oldenwald is like a forest. And you can go in there, and it was like on a hill, and it has these really picturesque scenes you can see go in the ruins, and you're looking like, wow, wow, wow. So I took lots of pictures somewhere. I don't know where they are now. It's been several years ago since I've been there, but, that was really interesting. I said, this is once in a lifetime. I'm going to go to the Frankenstein castle. But, if you ever go to Germany, that's one place I would recommend anybody to go. But right now, it's temporarily closed, and I believe it's probably due to COVID. Who knows? But, that's my tale of my horror scene. Do you have any horror scenes you want to talk about, Michael? You're the horror writer as well.
I have not had the opportunity to visit any particular horror locations. But some of these places in Romania, that area, when you see the photographs of them, they are so beautiful. I heard about a location. I'll tell you about a location. I just heard about it yesterday. But it's a series of islands off the coast to the west coast. Actually, it's only about 30 miles from San Francisco, this rocky outcropping. The Native Americans avoided it. They called it the Islands of the Dead. And right now it's forbidden for any human being to set foot on it.
Oh, wow.
It's always been dangerous because it's very surrounded by these rocks on which many ships were destroyed. It's also a location in which sharks are very much around.
Right, ferocious sharks, it sounds like.
And in addition to that, it also became the site of oil spills and nuclear waste spills.
Oh, wow.
So it can kill you multiple ways. But I thought it would be a great location for a film, even if you didn't actually shoot it on that location for obvious reasons.
I don't think you probably would make it there, Michael. You got sharks and rocks.
And it's actually, humans are banned from going there actually because it's become a nature preserve.
Oh,
but
wow.
Still, it's still funny to hear it that way. No human is allowed to set foot.
Exactly. That's not that same island where these people live, but it's like this indigenous group of people living there, and you go there, and some missionary had the nerve to try to go there that one time, and thought he was going to befriend them, and he ended up being dead, and they didn't recover him because it's too dangerous.
Yes, that island is off the coast of Inya, and near the Andaman Islands, I think. And yes, it's the government of India forbids anyone from going there, and the people that are there, they don't want anyone to come. They're hostile and frightened of outsiders. And this missionary nevertheless thought it was a good idea to go there and convert the people, and it did not work out well.
It didn't work out well for him at all. He's not here anymore, unfortunately. But coming up, we've got a little bit more coming up here with our writer and theologian, Christopher McAuley, PhD, and he will be talking about the pagan origins of Halloween, and I'm really looking forward to hearing him as well. So, you guys, please stay tuned with us. There's a little bit more on the way here on WQAT.
Oh, that's the last stop.
Some music, and I just freaking.
radio station of Allen Temple A.M.E. Church.
Beware of the blob, it creeps and leaps and glides and slides across the floor, right through the door and all around the wall. A splotch, a blotch, be careful of the blob.
On WQAT, radio station of Allen Temple A.M.E., downtown church in Greenville, South Carolina. Today is Halloween, the favorite night of the year for American children. But as most of us know, the holiday has pagan roots, and as a result, many Christians want nothing to do with it. But is it really sinister or satanic? We're going to speak with a very special guest who will shed light on Halloween. Irish-born writer Chris McAuley is a co-founder of the Stokerverse, who worked with our earlier guest, Dacre Stoker, to create the graphic novel The Virgin's Embrace, and has many other published works. He holds a PhD in theology and is an authority on Celtic mythology. Thank you so much for joining us, Chris.
Thanks for having me, man.
I understand that Halloween was originally a Celtic holiday. Who were the Celts, and what can you tell us about that holiday?
Yeah, the Celts were a pastoral people. They weren't an industrialized agricultural nation. And Halloween, or Samhain, as it's called, was about the end of summer, because that was particularly significant to them. It was the time of year when the structure of their lives changed radically. The cattle were brought down from the summer pastures in the hills, and people were gathered into the houses for the long winter nights. And long winter nights meant storytelling and handicrafts. So yeah, that's you can sort of chart a little bit of Halloween and the storytelling and the making of decorations maybe from that.
So in its most fundamental level, it was a harvest festival, really.
Yeah, it was a harvest festival. Samhain in the English Irish dictionary is sort of defined. It's also defined as All Hallowtide, the Feast of the Dead, and pagan and Christian times, signaling the close of the harvest and initiation of the winter season. Winter season lasted until May for the Celtic people. And it's particularly interesting because there's no archaeological or literary evidence to indicate that Samhain was a deity or a lord of the dead. It was primarily a harvest festival. Samhain Eve and the day of the celebration itself were not any particular festivals for any specific Celtic deity. Instead, it acknowledged the entire spectrum of non-human forces that roamed the earth during that period. So it's a harvest festival, but it's also a festival of the dead as well.
And I was interested to read that the sun was central to this holiday. Was the sun a big part of Celtic culture?
Yeah, I mean, every mythology has a link to the sun. With the Celts, we have the it's very similar to Beltane. There were bonfires that were lit on top of hills in Samhain, and it suggested that the fires were kind of imitative of sympathetic magic. They mimicked the sun and sort of helped the powers of growth to hold back decays and darkness of winter. They also served to symbolically burn up and destroy all harmful influences. And there's various accounts from the 18th and 19th century to suggest that the fires, smoke and ashes that came from these bonfires were thought to have protective and cleansing powers. Now, in Scotland, these bonfires were lit by a form of friction, or the Scottish termed it as force fire, and this force fire was seen as magic. In reality, they came from a stone wheel that had a hole bored out in the middle, and a log would have been put in between the hole. So the wheel would be turned. The friction of the stone wheel touching the timber would cause a spark, and it would light the bonfire. So the wheel is representative of the sun. There's also accounts of two bonfires being lit, and the farmers would take their livestock through the middle of the two bonfires, and this was a form of blessing. Villagers would also take flames from the bonfire back to their homes in the form of torches, and in parts of Scotland and in Southern Ireland, the torches of this burning turf were carried sunwise, so east to west in the direction of the sun, around homes and fields to protect them. And this sort of bonfire, the observance of the bonfire continued in the family home. The communal sort of fireplace for the family would be extinguished on Samhain or Halloween night to be relit again in the next day. There's a 17th century writer called Geoffrey Keating who claimed that this particular practice was an ancient tradition that was instituted by the Druids.
Now, you mentioned the Druids, and we have an image of Druids as being somewhat sinister figures. Who were the Druids exactly?
Well, the Druids were like the wise men of the community. They performed various functions, ceremonial functions, hand fasting, which would be the pagan form of wedding. They had obviously the link to the burial of the dead, but they had a very, very important function in society. They told the farmers when to actually plant their crops. And they did this because they knew the mysteries of the heavens, or as we understood, astronomy. So they were able to look at the star systems and see where they were, so they knew when winter was coming, so they knew when the best time to plant spring was, when the best time to reap was, and when to prepare for the winter. And that was really the base of their power. They were also mathematicians. They were skilled in the art of geometry. And one of the most fascinating places in Ireland is it's a place called Newgrange. It was built 5,000 years before the pharaoh Khufu built his first pyramid in Egypt. So they understood geometry. Now in Newgrange, and nobody really knows what Newgrange was for. It might have been a place for high kings to congregate, or for ceremonies to take place, burial ceremonies. But very specifically, there's a little hole, and just as the sun rises, there's the Venus star, or Lucifer, and as it rises, it goes into the hole and creates a pattern around the walls. People might know it. It's a circular pattern that you see quite a lot in Celtic symbology. So that's really who the Druids were.
That is just fascinating. Well, so we have the sun, and we have a harvest celebration. Seems quite benign. Where it gets spooky is this idea that during this period of Samhain, the barrier between the world of the living and the world of the dead can be breached, and the spirits of the dead, as well as other beings, can come over to our world. Can you explain that?
Yeah, well, the Celts believed that when people died, they went to this land of eternal youth and happiness called Tir na Nog. They didn't have a concept of heaven and hell that later civilizations had, and the Christian church ultimately brought into the land as well. The dead were always seen to be dwelling with the fairy folk, who lived in numerous mounds, and these mounds were called She, and the mounds dotted across the Irish and Scottish countryside. So Samhain was also the new year for the Celts. So in the Celtic belief system, turning points such as the time between one day and the next, or the meeting of the sea and shore, or the turning of one year into the next, they were seen as magical times. So the turning of the year was the most potent of these times. It was at this moment that the veil between the worlds was at its thinnest, and the living could communicate with their beloved dead in Tir na Nog.
Well, I read something, and maybe you can correct me or explain this a little more, that the ancient Celts, they actually dressed in costume. They dressed as animals and monsters so they would not be possessed by spirits. Is there anything to that?
Yeah, I mean, it's simple psychology. To not be afraid of the monster is, you become the monster, right? So that's why people dress up in that form of costume at Halloween to scare away, the spirits. More modern psychologists look at the concept of masks, and the mask, we're able to embrace our own inner fears. I mean, this is why kids dress up as Freddy Krueger and Michael Myers from Halloween. It's really to defeat their fears. But yeah, there's a practice that was used. The Celts used it. It was more a form of entertainment in a way as well. What you had was that the dead would be invited to the homes, and that gave the families the chance to interact with spirits until they left the following evening. So children would play games to entertain the dead, and adults would update the dead on the past year's news. And generally on that night, doors and windows would be left open for the dead to come in and eat cakes that had been prepared for them. But there was always maybe a few bad spirits that would come. So that's why people would dress up to try and scare them away in turn.
Well, you mentioned fairies, which most modern Americans think of fairies as a very benevolent creatures, maybe slightly mischievous sometimes. But how did the Druids and the Celts see fairies?
Well, fairies, or the Fae, they're creatures that inhabit a world that are invisible to humans. So most European nations have their own fairy tradition, and each of them have their own origin stories that are unique to them. Fairies first appeared in Ireland in the early 12th century and are heavily intertwined with the lore of the dead. As mentioned previous, that's where Celtic people believed that the souls of the dead went to be with the fairies. So some of the first tales of fairies sort of come from that belief of the dead living on in the burial chamber. The ancient Irish believed that the fairies were the first settlers of Ireland. These people were known as the Tuatha Dé Danann, and they conquered all of Ireland until they were defeated by the Milesians. The Milesians were the ancestors of the modern Irish people, and during this time period, the fairies of the Danann went into hiding and lived in the hills. And the fairies aren't like Tinkerbell from Disney stories. They were described as being the same height as normal people and being dressed in elegant green clothing. They had abilities such as being able to turn invisible and changing their appearance. They were almost like gods to mortal people, and they had interests such as music. They encouraged war and encouraged people to hunt as well. Their musical abilities were especially revered, and some of the best musicians of the time credited their works to fairies. Now, later on, with the advent of the Christian Church in Ireland, fairies were seen as angels who were cast out of heaven by God. So there's a particular tale that depicts God opening the floor of heaven and casting Satan and his other angels out. The angels who fell onto land first became land fairies, and the angels that fell into the sea became sea fairies. So these exiled fairies spent their time attempting to get back into heaven by stealing children's blood. So that's when fairies start to take on a slightly darker tone. They're also seen as mischievous, and they can cause misfortune to happen onto households. So you never curse a fairy or refer to them by their name, and we sometimes call them as the noble folk or good folk, just to remain on their best side. In fact, fairies are invisibly seen to dwell in the doorways of homes, especially.
Well, we know that there are these fairies wandering around on this special day, and there are the spirits of the dead, but there were also some other monsters that were kind of out and about. Can you just tell us a little bit about those?
Oh yeah. Now I'm going to make an absolute mess of the pronunciation of these monsters' names, but they are fascinating. There was the puka, who was a shape-shifting creature that received the harvest offering from the field. So again, we go back to the harvest concept. We've got a lady Glynn, who was a headless woman dressed in white, who chased night wanderers with a massive giant pig that was black. And then you have the precursor to the headless horseman, Dullahan. And they can appear as impish creatures, or most often headless horsemen who carried their heads riding flame-eyed steeds. And anybody who's watched the Sleepy Hollow film with Johnny Depp will be familiar with that. And their appearance was like the Banshee, a deaf woman to anyone who encountered them. And then there was a group of hunters known as the Fairy Hosts, who would hunt Halloween night, and they would kidnap people, and then the Slaw, and they would come from the west to enter homes and steal souls. So there was all sorts of very imaginative creatures that were fashioned out of stories that storytellers would tell. The storytelling aspect for these Celtic festivals and these dark nights is extremely important, because the storytellers who were professional, they would wander from home to home and basically get their food and board for telling a really good story. That was a profession in Ireland.
And was that thing of the fairies playing tricks, does that have something to do with that later, the development of the trick or treat idea?
No, it's trick or treat's interesting. Trick's more about actually performing a little like a trick or a performance, or things like that, and that comes into mumming around the Middle Ages. So as sort of mentioned previously, some of the Celtic celebrations had villagers that would disguise themselves in costumes made of animal skins to drive away nasty phantom visitors. In later centuries, people dressed up as ghost demons and other creatures in exchange for food and drink. That practice is known as mumming, and was the sort of precursor to trick-or-treating. So poor people would visit the homes of welfare families and receive pastries called souls cakes in exchange for a promise to pray for the souls of homeowners' dead relatives. And then it was a practice that was taken up later by children who would go door to door asking for gifts like money, food and ale. And yes, we drink very early in Ireland. So that morphed into a tradition called guising in Scotland. So you would dress up in costume and accept offerings from various households. So rather than pledging to pray for the dead, they would sing a song, recite a poem, or perform a little trick. So like stand on your head, or do a cartwheel before collecting their treats. And the treat would generally be fruit, nuts, or coins.
That is so cool. So much of it is, you can see how it's reflected in what we do in modern times. Well, how did the Christian church leaders reframe Samhain as a Christian celebration? How did that happen?
Yeah, it started in the 5th century, and Pope Boniface started that by trying to move the celebration to the 13th of May and used it as a day to celebrate saints and martyrs. The Irish, being thick-headed, didn't like that and continued on their pagan practices during the festivals of October and November. So then the church finally admitted defeat in the 9th century. Pope Gregory moved the celebration back to the traditional time and declared it All Saints' Day on November the 1st and All Souls' Day on November the 2nd. So October 31st then became All Hallows' Eve. Now, it still continued many of the traditional pagan practices. And really it survives because it was adopted into 19th century America through Irish immigrants. I know in Ireland that the Catholic Church encourages the celebration of Halloween, and it's not seen as anything that's terribly sinister.
Yeah. Well, so All Hallows Eve, as it was called by the church, becomes Halloween.
Yes.
So now, let me ask you this. It starts off as a pagan or pre-Christian holiday, festival. It becomes, in our culture, increasingly secularized. There's not really a trace of, other than in the trappings of its original purpose. But now, Wiccans, modern-day witches, people consider themselves white witches, have adopted Halloween or Samhain as a holiday. Could you tell us what's that like?
Yeah, well, Wicca, as far as I understand, I'm not an expert Wicca, but there was a Gerald Gardner revitalized it, sort of brought about a new pagan religion and termed it as Wicca, and attempted to follow some of the earlier practices of and now pagan just means country person, by the way. Pagan doesn't have any sort of magical or mystical meaning. It just means country person. So that the older tradition that people in the countryside would practice. And look, it's a very evocative time. You've got like ghoulies and monsters and all sorts of things, in people's imagination. So of course it's a great festival for anybody who practices witchcraft to latch onto.
Yeah.
The rational mind sometimes halts a little bit on Halloween. It's part of our culture. It's part of our nature. It has been for a long time. So it's just something that we're culturally programmed. I don't believe in ghosts or spooks or anything like that. But on Halloween night, there's always a little pause because we've been conditioned to believe that maybe it's possible. So, I can see it as being a very potentially potent holiday for anybody who wants to believe in that sort of stuff.
Sure. So as we wrap up, let me ask you, should modern-day Christians see Halloween in a negative light as a pagan ritual or as something positive with deep roots in our culture?
I would never tell anybody how they should see any festival or any event in life. There are aspects to Halloween that possibly might give rise to concern. For anybody who practices the Christian faith, I enjoy some horror films that you've got the good guys versus the bad guys, and the good guys always win. But there's some of the later films like the Saw films and Hostel and those that they're almost glamorizing violence a little bit too much. Don't get me wrong, as a horror writer, I write violence, I write violent scenes, but I try and inject some redeeming characters in there as well. I think that's really important. The concept of light versus darkness in whatever form you believe that takes is fundamental to our society, and it's fundamental to us as human beings. So in that aspect, I get where Halloween, as it is now, is very positive. It's the negative stuff of, for example, I walked past a Halloween person who had decorated their house for Halloween and saw them with gravestones with famous serial killers, and I'm not sure that we should be venerating the names of people who are serial killers. Should they be worried about infestation of demons and various nasties and all of that sort of stuff, and Satan reaching up under their bed at night to touch their cold toes? I don't think so.
Yeah.
I think the most important thing about Christianity for me is the concept of giving to the poor, to help the needy, to be more Christ-like. I leave the business of demons and devils to others, and I think more about the business of Christ and the sacrifice for your neighbour. I think that's infinitely more powerful than worrying about the forces of heaven and hell. Let them go about their own business. As a human being, you have your business to attend to, and the most powerful aspect of that is charity, and to constantly try and make yourself a better person through the teachings of the Christian faith in this instance.
Yes. Well, Chris, let me ask you this. If someone is interested in finding out more about you and your work, what is the best way for them to do that?
Yeah, the best way is to go onto Facebook and search for Stokerverse. And they'll find all the parts of our work and what we're doing and what we're up to next. Our publishers are AUK, Hellbound Books, and Scar Comics, with more to come. And I'm also published in the Hollywood Reporter now. So if they want to pick up the latest issue of the Hollywood Reporter, they'll get an exclusive Stokerverse story. And there's various games, both electronic and traditional, coming out next year as well, from Crooked Dice Studios, Nightfall Games, and Trinity Knot Studios.
Well, I'm really looking forward to a lot of that stuff, and then there's a writer you're working with that I just can't wait to see what you guys come up with. Well, Chris, thank you so much for joining me today.
That's a pleasure, mate. Really enjoyed it. Thank you.
You've been listening to our discussion about Halloween with Chris McAuley, Ph.D., a writer and expert on Celtic mythology. This is Michael Forsyth on WQAT, the radio station of Allen Temple A.M.E., the downtown church in Greenville, South Carolina.
You have just listened to Dr. Chris McAuley, Ph.D. You can also find Chris McAuley's latest graphic novel, The Vampire's Embrace, on Amazon.com and learn more about his collaborations with Dacre Stoker by visiting stokerverse.com. Again, I'm Rozzy D. Please stay tuned because there is more on the way here on WQAT. Hi there, Hello, it's me again, Rozzy D, along with Michael Forsyth, and again, you're listening to the wonderful WQAT-LP FM 99.5. We are the radio station of Allen Temple A.M.E. Church, the downtown church in Greenville, South Carolina. I truly want to thank Dr. Chris McAuley for being a part of today's segment. Thanks so much for the history and the information about Halloween. We truly thank you for being on today's segment. You know, Michael, Halloween is just not my favorite holiday. I hate to have to just say that here. However, I always try to keep an open mind about this day, and if it's your thing to celebrate Halloween, don't invite me because I won't be there. I kind of have that, what's that phobia we call, Michael, Sowenophobia about this dark holiday. But for me personally, Halloween encompasses too many negative things that I perceive as evil, like, ghosts, spooks, and witches and Wiccans and that kind of stuff, and I kind of steer clear of that. And I agree with Dr. Chris McAuley on focusing on doing the Christian things during Halloween by helping and doing good for others. So, Dr. McAuley, thank you so much for that. I truly appreciate you, reiterating my beliefs. Thank you for that. So I want to move on to our final commentary for today, and it is after an afterthought about throwing out the garbage. Since it's Halloween, here is a festering thought that can be very problematic for any one of us. Let me tell you that forgetting to throw out the household garbage can be compared to the power of forgiveness. Forgiveness is like throwing out your garbage daily instead of carrying it with you. And many people that I know have an awful habit of clinging on to, or should I say, having a really bad habit of carrying around old emotional and relationship garbage. The Bible tells us in Ephesians 4:3 to get rid of the bitterness and rage and anger, brawling and slander, along with every form of malice. Forgiveness is the number one tool to ensure you no longer sabotage your own future because of your past. Old hurts, disappointments, abuses, and pain need to be thrown out by the power of forgiveness. Forgiveness is a process, and you should start with the act of forgiveness. First, understand that the act of forgiveness is extremely powerful. When you fully understand that the act of forgiveness is extremely powerful, you need to speak it out loud, like, Lord, I forgive my mom, I forgive my dad, I forgive my uncle, grandparents, friends, or whoever it may be you need to forgive. When those words come out of your mouth, your brain begins to hear your declarations and your feelings will be released. The spiritual impact of uttering these words is immeasurable. Remember, Jesus said, "For if you forgive other people when they sin against you, your heavenly Father will also forgive you." And that's according to Matthew 6:14. Let me say to those who are holding grudges, or to the habitual grudge holders, you really need to know that forgiveness is for you, not for the person you're holding a grudge against, or, they don't care. You're holding a grudge against someone, they don't care. You have to forgive people for yourself. I do it myself. I know people do terrible things to me, but I forgive them. I forgive you. Forgiveness helps you take out the garbage. You need to do this because you are a phenomenal miracle made in God's image. I say it a million times, and I'm saying it again from another perspective here, that our lives are always moving in the direction of our strongest thoughts, and what we think shapes who we are. So if you're holding grudges, then in other words, your thoughts and actions make you appear like a stinking bag of rotting garbage, and nobody wants to be that. Therefore, reprogram your thoughts and practice the acts of forgiveness. Again, reprogram your thoughts and practice the act of forgiveness. I reiterate, because when not practicing forgiveness, it's like that forgotten bag of garbage that's being carried around in the trunk of your car. You know how that is, Mike. You ever left some garbage in the car? Over time, you will begin to stink just like old garbage because of your rubbish, garbage or trash, whatever you want to call it. That will keep you holding on to. You got to let that go. Please realize that when you discipline yourself and team up with God, that your thinking will be transformed exponentially. With God's help, you can transfer your mind. You can stop believing that lies and garbage that holds you back. And forgiving can end the vicious cycle of thoughts that are destructive to you and others. Allow God to renew your mind by saturating you with His unchanging truth. So therefore, the principle of this message is learn the act of forgiveness. Reframe your mind, your thinking, so that you can restore your perspective, because the act of forgiveness is for you. And that is today's festering commentary. All right, and amen with that. We are at the end of our segment, unfortunately, today, and I want to say a few final things before we go. I want to again thank internationally renowned horror writer Dacre Stoker and writer and theologian Chris McAuley for being a part of today's show. Thank you guys so much for being here. And finally, if you are listening to us and are not a part of Allen Temple A.M.E. Church and would like to join or visit, please go to our website at allentempleamechurch.org for more information and on how to be a part of this Sunday sermon via virtual broadcast. We also have virtual Bible study every Wednesday at noon and at 6:30 p.m. So check the church website or check the email bulletin for details. And as always, you are welcome to physically visit us here at 109 Green Avenue here in Greenville, South Carolina. Michael, you got anything to say before we leave out today?
I don't. I think it's just a wonderful show.
It was.
I would just say, remind listeners that to just keep their radio dial or their tune in on this station, because we have wonderful gospel music playing 24 hours a day.
We sure do. So, tune in. If we tune in on Sunday, we definitely want you here on Sunday. But, in the morning when you're getting dressed for work, also tune in again, because there's always some great music playing. So, don't forget about us. Again, I'm Rosie D along with Michael Forsyth. I am so happy that we could be of service through this broadcast. But until next time, stay healthy, stay safe, stay encouraged, and have a blessed work week.
It's gonna happen. Oh, yes, it will.
I remember the little church that we used to serve in.
Your inspiration station.
Way back in the womb.
WQAT-LP, Belton Anderson.
Amen.
A loving service of your friends at Allen Temple A.M.E. Church.
You could hear them singing the old hymns, and somebody in the corner would strike out and say, I love.
This is the People Station.
Come on, let me say it, church.